Good morning, folks. Thank you for joining us today after the holiday break. We hope everyone had a great holiday. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the call to discuss the draft tariff language for the Excess Behind-the-Meter Production Initiative. At this time, I'd like to introduce the colleagues in the room with me here today, beginning to my left.
This is Bill Weaver from CAISO Legal. John Gooden from Market and Research Policy.
This is Gabe Murtaugh from Policy.
Jill Powers, Policy.
Bianca Nambudi from Metering.
Thanks, folks. And just FYI for those folks that are just joining, we did just post an updated revised draft tariff language, which does make minimal changes to the original language. So FYI for anyone joining us just now, of course. The language can be found on our Stakeholder Processes webpage after you click on this initiative. As you may know, our calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. Recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. Of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without ISO's permission. And lastly, of course, if you have a question in the room, we ask that you please raise your hand by pushing #2, and you would release to stay in the queue, and we'll be sure to call on folks in the order hands are raised. And for everyone, of course, we ask that you please state the name and the company that you represent. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Bill.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone had a happy Thanksgiving. This is Bill Weaver from the Legal Department, and I'll be running this call today and managing the tariff revisions. Just some housekeeping items. My understanding is that this initiative is still scheduled to be implemented in the fall 2020 market release. So we still have a lot of time before this goes into effect. As with all filings, we file pursuant to FERC regulations, which is 60 to 120 days before the effective date, and usually 60. So you're looking at, we would file this with FERC 2 months before the fall release in 2020. As with all draft tariff language, we stakeholder the revisions, but as long as it's consistent with the policy approved by the board, it can be subject to minor changes here and there right up until we file. Based on the comments we received, I do not anticipate a further solicitation of comments or another call at this time, but I would encourage anyone who wants to revisit this or discuss it or has other suggestions to reach out to me. I'm always happy to hear anyone out on anything right up until when we file. That said, we received one set of comments on this initiative, so we're basically going through the tariff revisions and the changes from what we posted now, which, as Jimmy said, are very minor. Might modify further based on this call, but we will see. So let's see. So we received one set of comments from PG&E, who had some general comments on the top, and I'm just going to run through each of these. The first comment was that we should provide additional implementation detail prior to filing any of the tariff revisions. And of course, we do that. I would say that anyone who really wants to see the implementation details should participate on the calls about each of the market releases. What are the
RUG and the TUG.
Yes, the RUG and the TUG.
And technical user groups.
Right. Those will go over the actual specific software changes and market changes, and are a good source to discuss implementation details. The second comment was that the CAISO should consider the timing of implementing the gross load into the TAC rate calculation based on the various transmission owner rate filings. I think that would be a little difficult to do, especially given the fact that our transmission owners file their rates differently, being formula rates or stated rates. Our intent is simply to provide plenty of notice. We had this approved by the board a long time ago and said fall 2020. We're still, almost a year out. We're saying fall 2020, so I think we're going to stick to fall 2020. In any case, our, market software releases, especially for, kind of larger changes, are sort of intractable. So that's how we're going to address that. PG&E also requested that we do additional review of Appendix F and Schedule 3 to help ensure what corresponding changes need to go into the PTO's tariff. Ultimately, we're happy to, privately consult with any PTO who wants to discuss that offline, but I don't think publicly we weigh in on how we think the PTO tariffs should or need to be updated, those being their tariffs. But like I said, I'm happy to have those discussions. We can provide, I guess, free advice they can heed or not. And finally, we had, some specific changes on the tariff language, which I'll go through here. I think this is sort of a unique opportunity in that we already stakeholdered most of these draft tariff revisions during the stakeholder process itself before board approval. And so especially on, the meaty parts of this, the new gross load definition, I think we have it pretty much right where we want it to be, and I would be reluctant to make, substantive changes. No one offered substantive changes on this, but I'm saying we've already reviewed this in the stakeholder process, so I'm really not going to belabor it on this call here. I'll just sort of go over the delta on what's different and what's new that wasn't stakeholdered in the policy phase. And I'll apologize in advance. I know screen sharing tariff revisions and scrolling collectively often causes nausea among viewers, but we'll try to manage that as best we can. Okay, so starting with the Appendix A revisions, again, this is exactly what we had in the stakeholder phase. Fairly similar to what we have now, other than it's much more clear that demand served by excess behind-the-meter production should not be netted from gross load and should be included in that report. But now it'll be sort of we'll have an additional carve-out as well to report, clarifying as well that sharing a site means sharing a meter or being sub-metered. Moving along, we did have, if you remember at the end of the policy papers, we specified which tariff, which charge codes would be settled on gross load versus demand. Not all of those required tariff revisions, only a few did, such as voltage support here that used to say measure demand. Most of those in the tariff don't go into the detail of the billing determinant. And there was no reason to change that status quo. In fact, most of them are deep down into the settlements BPM. So here, this is one of the new provisions in requiring scheduling coordinators to report the excess behind-the-meter production value. PG&E suggested that it should be load-serving entity and not UDC. And I definitely understand what PG&E is getting at. I think the reluctance in changing it to LSC would be the fact that Section 26 and Appendix F really speak to tax charges being assessed on the UDC and MSS. Now that said, that's not necessarily, who it's being assessed on isn't necessarily the scheduling coordinator that's reporting the metering values. In any case, we determined that we don't actually need to specify. We can just say the SC who's reporting the gross load needs to also report the excess behind the meter production values. And so we've simply struck UDCs from our original proposed tariff language here on these new sections. PG&E also had some comments that this last, adverb, rather than accurately, we should say consistently. I get what the point of that revision is going at, but I think, ultimately we want to ensure that the transmission owners are all reporting gross load consistently among each other, but I don't think consistently is the right adverb for this, for how scheduling coordinators should report their gross load. They could all report it consistently but inaccurately, or if they all report it accurately within the new tariff revisions, then it will be consistent. Ultimately, consistency was the goal of this initiative, not necessarily this tariff revision, so I think we'll keep it as is. Last, there was a question on whether to include this last sentence within the tariff itself or the business practice manual. That's a good question, and we debated it internally as well. Ultimately, we think it has value to create a compliance obligation for the CAISO itself to keep these values, on OASIS publicly. Sometimes when we take things, when we don't have it in the tariff, years pass and we ask, why are we reporting this? And, well, let's go ahead and take it out. And then people complain, oh, we were using that value and we liked seeing it. So it's easier for everyone to keep it in the tariff. I'm going to pause here to see if we have any questions on anything I've said so far.
Thanks, Bill. Not the anything queue, but as a reminder, folks, please push pound 2. I'd like to ask a question.
Okay. I wanted to go back. One thing on Section 26 and Appendix F, even though those, what's happening in those business processes for those sections, is affected, most of them are written correctly now in that they already specify gross load, and really changing the definition of gross load, clarifying those issues meant that we didn't really actually have to make that many changes in Section 26 or Appendix F, just if you're keeping track at home. So here again, in Section 26, we sort of reiterate the exact same language that we saw above in Section 11, which is the settlement section, and we made, the exact same changes that we made there as well. And that is pretty much it. I think everything else speaks for itself, and we didn't receive any comments on. So I will pause here to see if anyone has any final questions or comments, noting again that, this is not a speak now or forever hold your peace. You have all the way up until, probably 60 days before the fall release to email me or reach out for any additional questions or suggestions.
All right, seeing no questions, we appreciate your time, folks. Thanks, Bill, of course. And as Bill mentioned, feel free to ask any questions leading up to the filing for 2020. So with that, have a great rest of your morning, folks, and we will await any further input. Thanks.
That now concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.